I would like to start by posing a question. Who here has bought a book in the last week? Exactly, not too many of you. If we were sitting here a decade ago, I can guarantee you that the figure would be at least twice the amount. The culprit? The internet, spiraling out of control, leading to a domino effect by leading to the explosion of social media. All forms, all varieties, from TikTok to Snapchat to Instagram, something for everyone to occupy our time. Whilst nowadays we use a small and interactive screen to occupy our time, previously society took an arguably more educated approach. Books, poetry, drama, literature, a crucial element of our lives that has shaped who we are today. Literature has evolved over time to form complex, twisted, and intertwined connections that we can learn vital lessons from. But the question is, where did literature originate? Some of the earliest evidence of stories come from the cave drawings in Lascaux and Chavaux in France. The drawings, which date back as far as 30,000 years ago, depict humans, animals, and objects, visual representations of oral storytelling. But back then, stories were told for the sheer purpose of practicality, a simple way of passing on to future generations things that otherwise would have been completely lost or forgotten. Much of our understanding of our culture comes from these stories that have been passed down through oral tradition by word of mouth. Such stories are known as folklore. These stories reveal much about the beliefs, customs, practices, ethics, and institutions of the cultures that they came from. Folklore stories do not have a single story and can instead be described as a product of the community that produced them. This means that they are actually made up of a myriad of different authors and can be seen as a method of communication to bind together communities. However, ultimately, the mere function of these stories was practical, a simple way of passing on traditions, survival skills, and basic life lessons on to future generations. However, naturally, as the world began to develop over the next hundreds of years, these stories began to evolve too. On a basic level, language became more accessible to a greater number of people, as male literacy rates soared from 69% in 1851 to 97% in 1900, meaning that writing became a more popular form of communication. But, more importantly, the intricacy and complexity of language shifted as we, as humans, began to manipulate words as a form of expression. However, you may be wondering, how have these stories changed and evolved so much? Why were these stories adapted over time? According to Jan van Sina, stories evolve over time due to selective memory, in which a storyteller will specifically erase or add different parts to their stories in order to shift the focus of the story or make it more memorable. This means that fairy tales, for example, are actually made up of a myriad of different authors, not just one, with so many layers of different characters and alternative theories twisting the story until it is made into something unrecognizable. Alien, which is the beauty of these stories, as they are the culmination of millions of creative minds spinning an endless weave of ever-changing stories. However, in some cases, this has caused the true authenticity of these stories to be lost. This has meant that only recently, within a modern audience today, have the true origins of these outlandish tales that were told long ago been revealed. These differences can clearly be seen in the classic tales of Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, and Snow White. So let's take, for example, Little Red Riding Hood. When it first comes to mind, what do you think of? A light-hearted, cautionary tale teaching us that we should not talk to strangers and that we should follow the right path. But what if I told you that the true origins were much, much darker? Initially, the tale follows the story of the wolf who arrives at the scene earlier and actually kills the grandmother, turning her body into a meal to be stored in the cupboard. The wolf then proceeds to assault the innocent child before inviting her to dine with him. Then, however, the girl actually remarks that this is a marvelous meal instead of complaining, which not only highlights the brutal violence of the wolf, but also sheds light on this cannibalistic, primal, instinctive nature of humans. This highlights that the disturbing values and general concepts of society have been shifted to cultivate a more positive message for society to consume. These tales have been altered from worrying depictions of barbaric behavior to a light-hearted bedtime story. And that is because we as a society have changed as well. We are no longer primal, animalistic creatures whose immediate instinct is to kill, but instead have adapted to become civilized citizens of society. However, that is not to say that many authors and playwrights do not tap into that primal, savage instinct, which is carried through from these ancient tales and enhanced by writers such as Shakespeare. whose portrayal of Macbeth is a clear reminder that ambition must be tempered by morality to avoid tragic occurrences and getting your hands bloody with guilt. This is clearly depicted by Macbeth's brutal murder of Duncan, which not only highlights his ruthless willingness to gain and climb to the top of the social hierarchy, but also his power-hungry and greedy human nature. This nature is also then later depicted in Golding's Lord of the Flies, where the inherent evil, selfish, and savage nature of humans is depicted at the end of the novel. When faced without the modern civilization, the paranoia of the boys causes them to lose their grasp on reality, which ends in them killing their own friend Simon, whom they believe to be a beast, mimicking the actions of their prehistoric ancestors. This symbolizes the last vestige of innocence and civility disappearing from the boys. They are no longer fragile and vulnerable children attempting to survive on an island, but instead have regressed into a pack of wild and savage creatures who have become pitted against each other and have no intention of helping each other to survive. Therefore, it can be argued that although evolved, the core primal themes of nature versus nurture remain a staple and crucial part of literature that continues to be interweaved throughout modern novels today, mimicking the traits of the first stories that were ever told. This links to our own inherent selfish human characteristics, as, ultimately, when faced with an extreme situation, survival instinct will kick in, causing any remaining moral compass to be lost, a key trait of human nature that has been communicated throughout stories via years. Another reason that literature is so crucial is that it has the power to establish a blueprint which has the ability to shape our own actions and moral compasses as we relate to or despise different literary characters. This can be perceived by how we perceive different characters through a multifaceted lens. Let's take, for example, the characterization of Blanche Dubois within A Streetcar Named Desire. Tennessee Williams combines different conflicting character traits to create a dynamic character who can be perceived through multiple lenses. Within the play, Blanche works tirelessly to emulate an impression of the stereotypical Southern belle, evoking a pure and innocent aura. However, as the play progresses, the deeper layers of dynamism to her character are shown. On one way, she can be perceived as this attention-seeking and promiscuous lady in red, or alternatively, can be more sympathetically viewed as a struggling, fragile individual who is struggling to cope from the trauma of her first marriage and the loss of her first love. This can also be paralleled by Du Maurier's creation of the multifaceted Rebecca, whom on one hand can be cynically viewed as a sly, selfish, evil, calculating, and manipulative femme fatale, or alternatively, as a strong-minded and independent woman desperately trying to make her own way in a traditionally male-dominated world. This very much depends on the personal connection between the reader and the novel, which is why the evolution of literature is so crucial, because it's increased the complexity by which these ideas are expressed, which allows us to relate to some different characters whilst discarding others. And so, although many of you may despise reading and stories, their importance really must not be underestimated. Although our lives are preoccupied with the rapidly changing technological world, ultimately, it is literature that remains at the central core of society. Literature serves multiple purposes, from the old to the young, as a form of communication, to pass down important moral skills and survival lessons onto future generations. Literature also allows humans a blueprint by which we may be able to establish and maintain strong and healthy relationships. But most importantly, the evolution in the complexity of stories and literature has generated the power to shape the actions and moral compasses of us as humans, which, ultimately, determines how we live our lives, something that is important to us all. Thank you.